Thank you so much. Yeah, this works. It works. Thank you for the invitation to KADK. I'm Ida Bencke. I'm a curator with the Copenhagen-based curatorial collective called Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology. We host exhibitions, we run a little publishing house, and most of all, we try to facilitate, cultivate, and hold space for alternative, interdisciplinary conversations that relate to planetary precarity, climate breakdown. And we like to situate our work in the sort of playful, we like to think of our work as playful and as full of hope, but also importantly modest hope, and very importantly full of grief and rage as well. So I'd like to just mention that. Our work sort of stems from this idea that ecology and questions of ecology and sustainability is about something that's much more profound than, for example, say green consumerism. It's something that demands much more of a radical reply. And I would, and this is just a side note because this is about beauty and aesthetics, and I'm an art curator who works within this field, I would never assume or claim that beauty or aesthetics hold the entire answer. But I do think that we might have a few things to say in this really, really large question. So, the work that we have been trying to do within the last 5 years, we've been doing work since 2015, 14-15, is to try and really ask into our identity as a human, what, not just this sort of scientific question, what are we? But also, who are we becoming, or who may we become? Which is, of course, is a question of aesthetics, it's also a question of politics, and of speculation. So I also just really briefly want to clarify that when I say we, I would like to situate this we within a very Western context. I do not claim to speak for any sort of universal humanity, but from a very specific Western epistemology, a very specifically Western take on humanity, on nature, etc. And I would also argue that a lot of sort of the problems that we're facing, and also in these kinds of conversations, come from this very bad and lazy habit of universalizing from our own perspectives and our own experiences, embedded as they are within white privilege and sort of internalized logic of capitalism. So let's just get that straight from the beginning. So the laboratory, of course, connotes the experimental. It's about holding space open for experiment and also for failure. And that's a very, very important part of our work, to sort of hold space open for failure and see what might happen when we're not afraid to fail, also within sort of artistic experiments. We like to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway, who is a very influential feminist philosopher and biologist that we have been studying a lot. We've also translated some of her works. She says, stay with the trouble. And in our work, staying with the trouble might mean, it can mean a lot of things, but it might mean that we come to think about and with and through different kinds of more than human aesthetics. And that's what I would like to talk to you just briefly, talk briefly about today. We have worked with water, for example, what we call hydrofeminism, with fermentation as a sort of feminist technology. We have worked with matters of care, reparation, restoration, maintenance. And within the last couple of years, it's become more obvious to us that what we have actually been doing all this time is that we've been trying to move away from critique, or move away from this sort of deconstructive modus. Though we definitely need deconstruction, we need to deconstruct what we mean when we talk about humanity, when we talk about nature, etc. We also need to look into regenerative practices, and we need to start to propose alternatives. So that's a kind of basic idea. And I would like to talk about a project that I did that's called multi-species storytelling. And that was an attempt to think academic and artistic thinking together, to try and create a space where they could challenge and hopefully redo and change each other a little bit. It was a conference, it was also an exhibition, and it was a pre-conference roundtable situated in a stable in a local farm in Sweden with horses, humans, and cows. And I'll get into that a little later. And it was something that was done at the Linnaeus University in Sweden, in Småland. And of course, that's a really interesting place because this is where Carl von Linné, who, if you have not heard about him, was the sort of founding father of modern biology, the founding father of botany, and he was the one who came up with this way of classifying species. He said, God creates and Linnaeus names. So the idea of naming things, of giving names to nature or to the world, the question of naming and of language and the power that lies within this naming is something that's very important to this project. And so this is a very formative quote. It's a Donna Haraway quote. It says, "It matters what matters we used to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories." So, and this, of course, there's enough material for a whole conference within this quote, obviously. But what I would just really like to stress here is the sort of really intimate connection between story and world. Inspired by the indigenous thinker Robin Wall Kimmerer, also, who said that the problem of restoration, of restoring ecological habitats, is also a question of restoration. And so the question of language and of story becomes really difficult, of course, when entering into this field of multi-species aesthetics that I would like to propose here, because language, of course, is something that we think of as a human enterprise. But of course, we're always sort of enrolled in these multiple conversations with the non-human, with the cells and animals and plants and fungi. And you could also say that our very own bodies are sort of interfaces for these multiple interspecies conversations that are always happening all the time, which of course is also the idea of biosemiotics, which is a very interesting field of knowledge that sort of asserts that language and conversation and dialogue does not merely belong to the human sphere, but it's something that is happening on all kinds of scales, and that the human language is but a sort of dialogue, local dialect, sorry. And the problem, of course, being that we don't really have the scientific apparatuses, we don't really have the cultural imagination to think through what these kinds of multi-species conversations might mean for us, and how we might work with them in different kinds of ways and less destructive kind of ways. So I was undertaking this project very much guided by American artist Karin Bolender and her donkey, her ass, because ass is also the word for donkey, of course, called Aliass. Karin has lived and worked with Aliass for 10 years at least. And so this practice is very much about how we might commit to more than human relationships. Karin is an author and an artist, so she was asking, how may I tell the story about me and Aliass, me and my companion species? And so they went on a journey through the, whoa, I was falling here. They went on a journey through the US, and while they were, and so the idea was that this journey together was an artwork, and they were just they were walking through these post-industrial landscapes, and while they were walking, Karin found out that Aliass was actually pregnant. And that was a problem for many reasons, but one of the reasons why that was a problem is because when the female body is pregnant, it's preparing this milk for the newborn. And this milk is a direct response to its surroundings. So you're not supposed to really remove a pregnant body all too much, because it's actually trying to adjust to its surroundings. It is sort of registering all the pathogens and all the different kinds of potential dangers that can be in a landscape, and it's creating this milk as a perfect response to that, as a sort of healing remedy for the newborn. And so when Karin started to think of a milk as a way of writing the story about these landscapes they were in, because Aliass' body was registering these landscapes in a different kind of language, if you could say that, and she chose to make. She made a soap out of this milk, and she wrote the story, and we published the story about her and Aliass. But so you can see there's a book and there's the milk, because of course you can make soap out of milk, but the beautiful idea here, I think, of what was interesting for us was that the story was not in the book, the story was in the soap, it was in the milk. It was a sort of transcription of the relationships between Karin and Aliass and the unborn fetus and all the different kinds of bacteria that were in their surroundings. So that was one example of multi-species storytelling. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes, great. So Karin came to Sweden for this multi-species storytelling conference exhibition project. And she and I went to Kultivator, which is a really, really interesting place in Öland in Sweden, which is an experimental farm and art collective. And so I think that this is one of the very exciting, I think that looking into how we may rethink food productions and how we may rethink cohabitation with other species in a sort of farming environment. I think that that is something that is so interesting, because of course food production is like a major, major problem and question within this crisis that we're facing. So Kultivator, amazing collective, and they do really, really radical work. For example, they have designed their farm in a completely different way. So what they have done is that they have fenced in the humans, and the animals are free to roam the entire space. They have also built a kitchen in the stable, in the horse stable, so that they might cook and eat with their horses, for example. So like really interesting ways of rethinking human-animal relations in a production unit, because it is a farm that produces milk and meat. But Karin came to Kultivator, and because we wanted to create this conference setting that was about more than human stories, we were asking ourselves, how do we do that? How do we, because this is a very human setup, obviously, a conference at a university or an exhibition in an art space. And we were thinking about maybe bringing a horse or a cow to the university, but it also became really obvious that that was not a good answer to this problem. This would be very much a way of sort of attending to the human need of the spectacle, you know, look, here's a horse. Now we're doing like a real interspecies conversation. Obviously, that would make sense maybe to us, but it wouldn't make much sense to the horse. So I was thinking about how to create sense, how to make sense in a more than human, in this situation of trying to engage the animals, in this case the animals, but not just on our own terms. And so what we did was we made this, we asked ourselves, what makes sense to animals? What would make sense to them? And of course, eating makes sense, like food makes sense. So we were thinking about the round table, which of course is also a conference genre. And we wanted to do a round table in the stable. And we wanted to, beautifully, companion comes from the panis, which means with bread. So we want to break bread with these animals in the stables. And this turned into an art project where Kultivator and Karin were inviting the horses and the cows to lick. And we were to lick these plates, and we cultivated the plates, we cultivated the bacteria that were on the plates. We were sort of tracing these micro-companions that were on the tongues of the animals, and that became this beautiful image of a bacteria culture that we then drew on that tablecloth, and the table and the cloth went into the university. And so during a very human conference setting, the table was present, the bacteria were present, and we were also inviting people to sit at this table and to trace these microbiotic sort of traces, and to sort of suggest that they hold stories that were in a different kind of language, but nevertheless really important stories that we still don't really have a proper form for. And I have to stop now. Yeah. I should maybe say that, of course, this is not aesthetics or beauty in any conventional sets, and that's maybe also something we can talk about in the discussion afterwards. You know, beauty, how to rethink beauty from a more than human perspective, I think is something that's really interesting, because it also relates to the questions of what is beautiful to whom. Yeah, I'll stop now. Thank you so much.